Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we're breaking down Chapter 3 of How Progress Ends by Carl Benedict Fry, The Rise of Europe.
Hi everybody, I'm Matthew, and today I'll be going over to talk about Chapter 3, The Rise of Europe. So in this chapter, Frey explores a big historical question, that is, why did Europe become a center of global innovation and economic growth? Why Europe and not China, the Middle East, or other advanced civilizations at the time? Frey argues that Europe's success was not because Europeans were smarter or more advanced from the start. In fact, after the fall of Rome, Europe was relatively fragmented and in many ways behind other major civilizations. But this weakness turned into a strength. Unlike large centralized empires like the Imperial China, Europe was politically divided into many competing states and city-states. There was no single ruler who had total control. And at a first glance, this fragmentation seemed a little chaotic or unstable, but it created a powerful competition. And because Europe was decentralized, rulers had to compete with each other for talent, trade, and innovation. If a scientist, merchant, or inventor felt restricted in one region, they could just move somewhere else. This competition limited the ability of any one authority to completely suppress new ideas. And Frey emphasizes that this political fragmentation allowed experimentation. Different regions tried different approaches economically, technologically, and politically. And over time, the most successful innovations spread. He also highlights that the role of institutions, European cities gained relative autonomy, trade networks expanded, and knowledge flowed across borders. These institutional conditions help sustain long-term innovation. The key takeaway from this chapter is that Europe's rise was not inevitable. It was the result of a decentralized political power and institutional competition, which created an environment where innovation would survive and grow. Frey uses this historical example to support a broader message in the book. Progress depends on the right institutional balance, where too much central control can suppress innovation, but too much instability can prevent it from taking root. So in conclusion, chapter 3 shows that Europe's rise was driven not by destiny, but by a unique political and institutional structure that allowed innovation to flourish. Thank you.
Hey, we're about to talk about two different figures within this chapter, The Rise of Europe. The first one is one I drew. It's the difference between a centralized and decentralized power structure within a country and how that impacts innovation. And then the second one is GDP growth throughout time from the year 1000 to the year 2000, with a focus on the UK and China, and how the level of innovation from Europe changed how much they benefited and how fast they got into the Industrial Revolution comparatively to something say China. Let's talk about it. First, power structures. Here is a centralized power structure. A centralized power structure relies on someone on top, let's say the leader, having different managers managing those managers, and then workers, all down in a beautiful line. It makes sense to a point. You get clear decision making from people from up top. You ask them for stuff. Strong control. It's very consistent. You get uniform policies, procedures, and messaging. It's efficient. It's cost effective, but it does not encourage ingenuity. Comparatively to something like This this is a decentralized power structure, something we would see in Western Europe, i.e., with guilds, unions, and more particularly, companies. People working for themselves, trying to optimize their labor. Mm-hmm. Though maybe messy, far more costly, makes everything harder. It breeds innovation, mainly because this, as we saw in Asia, they people down here are working for this person up here. These people may have ideas, but if it does not serve the goal of the people above them, they won't act on it. Like, for example, in China, they would have people down here trying to optimize labor, but would be denied because the people on top need the laborers so they can fund their country. It's a vicious cycle of self greed. Comparatively, here everyone's fine for themselves. You don't need to look up to people. And even if the people you're looking up to, they don't really have much control over you because it's more free. Thus, innovation ran rampant. For example, especially in the UK, where this was especially true. Thus, as we can see in this graph right here, they were able to lift off into their thing, even though they had a decentralized power structure. It's very strange to me, but it also makes a lot of sense. When we look at the figures, China, even though they had more leveled out, they could not change. There is no ingenuity involved because why would they need to change? Their system was good. Everyone worked for each other, and as long as they kept going like that, no change was needed at all. Or in Europe, they wanted change. They wanted new things. Change was great. As it was cutting costs and made labor more efficient, it was great. Like, it was something that they needed, thus leading to the rise of Europe.
All right. Chapter 3 of Frey's book, How Progress Ends, centers on the idea of understanding the struggle for economic innovation. Frey opens this chapter with a quote by Niccolo Machiavelli. There's nothing more difficult, uncertain, or perilous to take in hand than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well in the new. By breaking this down into 3 segments, barred in red, in this bottom line, we can get 3 key takeaways that essentially summarize Frey's message for chapter 3. First segment highlights the uncertainty of leading change. There's nothing more difficult, more uncertain than to take the lead in the introduction of new things. This part understands that leading change is inherently risky. Starting anything entirely new is bound to be uncertain, it's bound to fail, have problems, and there's no guide to something that hasn't been done before. Frey makes an example of this by comparing Europe's economic development to Rome's. Compared to Rome's central management, which is actually one of the reasons leading to its downfall, Frey describes Europe's decision on a decentralized economy. The decision created an environment that promoted experimentation and innovation during the Industrial Revolution, allowing for entrepreneurs and investors to pioneer and grow markets independently. While it doesn't deny the possibility and price of personal failures, it does allow a more stable way for a country to learn and adapt to the global market. Like a guess and check, but with more than one attempt to get it right. Second segment of the quote, barred in red. The innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions. This means that others are often reluctant to follow new uncharted innovations. This is because innovations are inherently uncertain, from the previous one, or that it threatens their wealth, status, or influence. For example, Frey introduces pre-industrial societies like medieval craft guilds. They oppose new technology because existing standards already secured the rent and status of workers. Those proposed advances threaten the existing craft monopolies and production norms of worker privileges. Overall, the author makes the point that institutional and economic progress often requires having to navigate around or possibly tailor to opposing interests, as avoiding conflict and gaining support from these groups, especially those in power, are vital for economic innovations to progress. Now, this last segment, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well in the new. This last part understands that innovation needs beneficiaries. However, those who support innovation are often hesitant or limited in the support. Frey understood that most support for innovation were those looking to prosper from change. He makes example of medieval Europe again, as they introduce experimental technology for mills, mining, and weaving looms. The small merchants and craftsmen who supported the inventions hoped to gain from its capabilities, but lacked political power and risked losing their investments if the innovation failed. On top of that, those who were in power and held influence often resisted economic innovation, overall limiting new ideas. All in all, Chapter 3 of Frey's book, How Progress Ends, highlights the process and struggle for economic innovation in three ideas. Understanding leading change is uncertain. It will have opposition and will have limitations to those who do support it.
One of Fry's main arguments is that Europe's political fragmentation actually helped it innovate. Unlike China, which was unified under a centralized empire, Europe was divided into many competing states: England, France, the Dutch Republic, various German states, Italian city-states, and more. At a first glance, fragmentation sounds inefficient. Wouldn't one strong empire be better? Here's where the mechanism kicks in. Imagine this diagram. Fragmented Europe, competition between states, ruler supports inventors plus merchants, more experimentation, technological process. Because rulers competed with one another, they had incentives to attract skilled workers, protect merchants, fund new technologies, and strengthen military and industry. If one ruler suppressed innovation, inventors could move somewhere else. In contrast, in a centralized empire like Imperial China, if the top leadership restricted something like overseas exploration or certain industries, there were far fewer escape routes. So Europe's lack of unity created a marketplace of ideas. Competition between states acted like natural selection for institutions. The second mechanism is decentralized exploration versus centralized stability. The second mechanism builds on this idea. Fry argues that centralized systems are good at exploiting existing technologies, but decentralized systems are better at exploring new ones. When the future is uncertain, when no one knows which technology will work, you need many small bets. Europe's decentralized structure allowed independent inventors, merchant networks, universities, weak but widespread intellectual exchange. This horizontal structure fostered experimentation. In contrast, centralized systems tend to prioritize stability and control. That's great for scaling up a known method, but risky for radical innovation. Europe happened to be structured in a way that rewarded experimentation. Just as new technologies like the printing press, improved navigational tools, and later steam power began to emerge, the structure matched the moment. And so those are the two key mechanisms in Chapter 3. A common misconception: Europe was just culturally superior. Some people argue that Europe rose because of the superior culture, maybe Protestant ethics, or some inherent European work ethic. But this explanation falls apart for two reasons. China had world-leading technologies for centuries. It developed paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass long before Europe. Cultural traits changed slowly, but economic dominance shifted quickly. If culture were the main driver, it wouldn't explain rapid reversal of fortune. Instead, Fry emphasizes institutions and political structures, how power was organized, and how decision-making systems encouraged or discouraged experimentation. So it wasn't that Europeans were smarter or harder working. It was that Europe's competitive fragmentation created an environment where innovation was harder to suppress. Big takeaway. So here's the core insight from chapter 3. Europe didn't rise because it was unified and strong. It rose because it was divided and competitive. Its fragmented political structure encouraged experimentation, allowed innovators to move freely, created institutional competition, and prevented total shutdown of new ideas. Meanwhile, centralized empires could stall innovation if leadership chose stability over risk. Progress depends not just on having ideas, but having systems that allow many ideas to compete.